What are you doing here? I thought you were banished. Hey, what's the matter?
You people and your God, you talk in circles. You offer just enough evidence, but never enough to be conclusive. Then you fill in all the gaps with, you just gotta have faith. It's a bunch of nonsense.
You're really irritating. You know that?
Don't start with me, Kenny.
You don't waste a lick of time bragging to all of us how great a reporter you are. So why can't you put up or shut up on this story?
What are you even talking about?
Here's where the chili meets the cheese, my friend. One of my heroes was C.S. Lewis, a man who began as a skeptic, much like yourself. At the end of his journey, you know what he said? He said if Christianity is false, it's of zero importance. But if it's true, there's nothing more important in the entire universe.
Great quote from C.S. Lewis. If Christianity is false, it's of no great significance. If untrue, it is of great significance. There is nothing more important that you can commit yourself to if Christianity is true. So today we're remembering the most significant moment or event in the Christian faith. And I know that there's a lot of focus that shifts typically with churches onto Easter, as it is Resurrection Sunday. Of course, a great event that we celebrate. But today really marks the gruesome execution of an innocent man over 2,000 years ago. And like we talked about as we opened up, it's come to be known as Good Friday. If you're part of our church, I will often point out the obvious, and that is that death is not only the only way that everybody exits this life, and some of you are very familiar with this concept, as once again, you've experienced a significant loss. But that is the one thing that is part of everybody's human experience. Everybody will experience death, regardless of age. And when we experience death, we understand the intrusion that it is. It doesn't feel good. It's something that seems wrong in our minds. I often said how at times we look at the life of a young one and we say they died before they even had a chance to start living. Then we see the life of somebody that is in their mid-30s and they're talking about, well, that's their prime of their life. Their life was cut short. Then we look at the life of an older person and we say, we had so many more memories that we could have built. Death is never a good time. It's always going to be intrusive no matter when it takes place. And once again, all of us have experienced death to some extent, but we've come to cope with it in different ways. It's hard for us to really reconcile this, but for most of us, death can have a positive change in our lives. It can make us look at things differently, appreciate things differently, as we understand the raised awareness of death. One thing that I would venture to say, is that nobody in this room would say that death is anything good. I don't think any of us would come to that conclusion and say, well, this person died, I know it's a great thing. Especially, once again, if it happened in the prime of their life. That's typically the time that we struggle with the most. Whether it's somebody in high school, whether it's somebody that just started their life, when you hear of maybe a young parent who is just getting started and they die. So that's typically in the 20s and 30s. So again, if we really break it down and understand, death is never good. Death is always intrusive. Death is never going to be ideal when somebody dies in the prime of their life. Why would the church consider the most important divine figure in history, his death, why would we consider it as something that is considered good? And the reason why, I'm going to guess, this is not going to come as a shocker to anyone, is because we know how the story ends. We understand that that's not the end. And once again, this is something significant where each gospel is recording this idea that once again, there is a resurrection that is coming. And the resurrection is so important, and I know that I'm jumping the gun, but just hear me out before we kind of dive into today's topic. The resurrection is so significant in the Christian faith that it could be dismantled very quickly. If you could disprove the resurrection, then you pretty much debunk Christianity. Paul writes this, and if Christ has not been raised, then all of our preaching is useless and your faith is useless. You want to destroy Christianity? Debunk the resurrection. Simply prove that there is no way that it happened. Without the resurrection, Paul is saying, hey, what I'm doing up here, everything that you claim to believe, it's useless. It's pointless. Again, I understand that this is Sunday's message, but we kind of have to start backwards as we're preparing our hearts for the celebration that we have. Because if Jesus didn't die, then the resurrection is just a hoax. And it seems counterintuitive to even bring up that topic, but if Jesus never died, then he never had to come back to life. He simply continued to exist in a way that would have given people a false sense of hope. So the resurrection isn't true if Jesus didn't die. Now, it sounds crazy to us because we think about the crucifixion and we think, well, there's no way that he survived. However, there are skeptics that believe that there is enough evidence to disprove that Jesus actually died and many other things along the way. It sounds crazy to people that have been in the faith for a long time, but there are many who are part of the faith that don't even know how to defend that. Like, how do you defend when they start to make arguments that maybe, perhaps, can be true? And Paul's telling you, if the resurrection isn't true, then realistically what you believe is pointless. If Jesus didn't die and he simply was put in a way to recover so that he could make an appearance, then realistically, he never died and the resurrection never took place. Your faith is still useless. So a number of years back, I watched a movie called The Case for Christ. This was an incredible movie. It was released, once again, a number of years, and it depicted moments that really were defining for a pastor, at that point atheist, and now he's a pastor and apologist by the name of Lee Strobel. Lee was determined to disprove that Christianity was false to his recent convert wife because they were both atheists. And if he could do that, then realistically, they could kind of go back to living the way that they were. They didn't have to worry about it. Now, throughout the movie, there's a number of questions that the skeptics have, or even different rebuttals towards the church. And I think it's a great way that we can actually understand faith a little bit better. I'm going to feel bad saying this, but if you know me, you understand this. I'm not the biggest fan of Christian movies. And the reason why is because they're typically pretty poorly made and they're pretty corny. But The Case for Christ is a very well-put movie. And it's a great way that it not only gives you the story of an atheist, but it actually also helps you to give you the tools to defend your faith. Now, originally for this evening, I didn't know I was going to have a chance to really put a message together because Easter is really what we're pushing our focus for, because sometimes you run out of time. But what I had proposed is to really watch this entire movie, The Case for Christ, because it's a great movie. But rather than doing that, I wanted to take the time to really just kind of push to the highlights and really understand why Jesus' death is so significant and why it's so good. Now, if you haven't watched the movie, I'm encouraging you. You need to watch it. It's a great movie. And if you have already watched it, watch it again. It's a great movie of encouragement. Now, one of the common reservations that people typically have regarding the authority and reliability of the Bible, in other words, how can we trust the Bible as a historical document, is what makes the Bible unique from any other historical document? I mean, and it's a great question. Why is it that we trust the Bible so much that people are willing to live their lives around this novel or this story, when in reality it's just simply an outdated book? So does that mean that if I go to my yard, I write a novel or write a book or write something that I say, God inspired me to write this, and somebody digs it up, does that mean that 2,000 years from now, people can just come and say, well, it's old and it must be true? So that's the first question that people have. The second question is, how can we know the reliability of the Bible when we don't have the original copy, we have copies of copies? And this is something that often comes across. I know for youth group, our teens typically ask, or this is typically a question that comes up, and that is, how do we know that the Bible is reliable when there are so many translations of the Bible? How do you know what the original said? How do you not know that things haven't been added to it? Can we actually trust the modern Bible when it has continually been translated for the last 2,000 years? Maybe the story has changed. Maybe people along the way realize, well, this doesn't fit the narrative, so let's change it and make it more adaptable to what we want to push towards people as a church. So maybe, once again, this is a question that you've had, and this is something that the movie tackles. So once again, we're going to be watching very short clips. They're not very long. So I want you to kind of stay focused in on the clips because it's going to help you answer some of the questions that we're going to be talking about it. And at the end, I'm really going to try to tie it together and help you to understand why it is that today is so significant and the answers that you can have to defend your faith. And once again, maybe the first question is going to be, maybe the people who made copies of the copies inserted along the way, maybe inserted some of the things that the church dies for regarding the death and resurrection of Jesus. And the death and resurrection of Jesus is simply a myth. Check this out.
I'm a bit of a history buff myself, so yeah, I'm particularly intrigued with your archaeological work.
Former life.
Former life, yes. I'm a bit surprised, given your stellar reputation, that you just gave all that up for this.
Would you like to be more specific?
Well, it just seems to me that for the better part of 2,000 years, Christianity has been creating these rituals and these rules. You know, they've erected these elaborate and often expensive cathedrals, and all of that to support a faith that I believe is ultimately built on sand.
And yet, it's all still standing.
Yes, because people keep telling each other the same stories over and over again. Just because I write something down and I bury it in the dirt, that doesn't make it true.
I think I'm beginning to see the crux of your visit.
Look, I understand that a number of people claim to have seen Jesus after his crucifixion, and some of them even wrote it down. But I guess my question is, how can we be sure of the reliability of those manuscripts?
Well, the same way we authenticate any historical document, by comparing and contrasting the copies that have been recovered. It's called textual criticism. The more copies we have, the better that we can cross-reference and figure out if what the original was saying is historically accurate. And the earlier they come from in history, the better. Take Homer's Iliad, for example.
Is this real?
That's as real as the Macedonian dirt that I dug it up from.
Well, the Greeks considered this their Bible for many centuries.
Yes, they did. That is one of 1,565 copies in existence today. Now, the Iliad was originally composed 800 years before Christ.
Okay.
This Greek copy is dated at the 3rd century AD.
So, 800, etc. So that's 1,100 years between this copy and the original, yes?
Correct. There is only one ancient collection of writings that has more authenticated copies than the Iliad. Can you guess what that is?
You're going to tell me the Bible.
The New Testament.
And how many copies is that?
To date, archaeologists have recovered 5,843 Greek New Testament manuscripts. That's 4 times as many as the Iliad.
Really?
The earliest fragment of the Gospel of John was found in ancient Egypt, and it dates to 2nd century AD.
How close is that to the original?
Less than 30 years. I have one of the fragments in my collection. It's quite a treasure, isn't it? After the New Testament and the Iliad, the runners-up don't even come close. We only have 100 copies of Sophocles, 7 copies of Plato's Tetralogies, and only 5 copies of anything by Aristotle. In fact, if you laid the surviving copies of Aristotle one on top of the other, they would make barely 4 feet. You do the same with surviving copies of the New Testament, the stack would be a mile high. Nothing else in history even comes close. How is that for reliable?
If that didn't make sense, let me try to help you make a little bit of better sense of it. So the New Testament has more manuscripts than any other historical book. which tells you this. We often don't question the validity of any other historical book, even though there are more manuscripts of the Bible that we found to date, over 5,000, almost 6,000, just of the New Testament, not including the Old Testament. And maybe that just seems like, well, that's just copies of copies. Here's the thing that is being described here. The closer you get to an event, the more reliable the witness account is, which is what the four Gospels are, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're recording eyewitness accounts of what people saw, so the closer you get to the event, the more reliable things are. Now, when you find more copies, here's what you can do. You can actually look and criticize the text and try to compare them all. So the more copies you get, the more you can compare them to the original text. And one of the things that has been found is even though there are variations that are minor, they all stay consistent to the same theme. So when you get down to the reliability of the Bible, we have more historical manuscripts that ultimately point you to the fact that the Bible is reliable because we have copies upon copies, and every copy is getting you closer to the original text. The closer you're to the original text, the better. To the original event. So once again, we have a reliable text. And most people say, well, there's so many copies. And here's the foolish way that people often make this argument. When it comes down to copies that we have, so the translations that we have, you have to understand that those translations are actually not done they often compare it to telephone. If you've ever played the game of telephone, what do? You start with somebody originally saying something, and then it's passed down to the next person, and they relay the message, so forth and so on. We often think about the translations being like that, a game of telephone. Here's the issue. It's a misconception because when people translate the Bible, they don't go to the most recent translation. They go to the original, which in the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. In the New Testament, it's written in Greek and in Aramaic. We don't go to the latest copy to make a copy of it. We go to the original text. And when people make an argument and say, well, there's so many different copies, but we're still going to the original. It doesn't really matter. So we have so many different manuscripts that are telling you the same story. The eyewitness accounts. They're telling you that there was a man that lived in the region of Israel who ultimately lived a certain type of life, which we're not really focusing on that, but died a certain death and was claimed to be seen afterwards. And that's the reliability of the Bible. There's over 5,000, almost 6,000 copies of the New Testament alone. So once again, this is helping us to understand you're not building your faith on something that is shallow and that is not set on solid ground. Now, the next thing that comes into the question, because once again, we're talking about the death for today, about Jesus, is that did Jesus die? And we say yes, but then we understand that, well, he was discovered by women. And ladies, not trying to offend, just simply trying to put it into perspective, women's accounts were not reliable. What women claimed was not deemed as something that could be used as a defense. So with that being said, okay, let's just say we have over 5,000, almost 6,000 copies in hand. Is it still reliable when the women are the ones that are claiming that they found him? Check this out.
Maybe the reason
that the tomb was empty was because Jesus' body was never there in the first place.
because we know that the Romans used to throw the bodies of crucifixion subjects to the dogs, right?
Well, there's no evidence for that, but there are specific records that didn't happen to Jesus.
And what records are those?
Well, actually, the earliest recorded accounts tell us that Jesus was properly buried in a tomb. And the Romans did allow for burial of some crucifixion victims.
But then there's something that still doesn't add up
To me about all of these supposed eyewitnesses.
that claim to have found Jesus' empty tomb.
What, the fact that they were all women?
Yeah, because we know that according to Jewish customs, women were deemed to be unreliable witnesses. Am I right?
Well, true. So why did all four gospel writers record that it was women who discovered the empty tomb?
I'm asking you that.
Well, if you were a first century Jew making up this story out of thin air, then you would never say that women discovered the tomb. It would damage your case, not help it.
Okay, so maybe we're dealing with the world's most inept disciples.
Or maybe the disciples reported what actually happened and let the chips fall where they may.
Okay, all right, but you have to admit here that there is a gaping hole in all of this.
A gaping hole.
I mean, the fact that the Gospels are filled with contradictions about the empty tomb. Okay, if I turned in a story that was this jumbled, I'd be out of a job. If we look through the Gospels, you start at Matthew. Okay, Matthew puts Mary Magdalene and some other Mary at the tomb. You flip over to Mark, he adds Salome. You go to Luke, he adds
Mary, mother of James, and then some lady named Joanna.
What is that? You need a sharper guide to sort your way through this mess.
Sure, there are differences, but that doesn't trouble most historians.
Why? Why doesn't that trouble? It troubles me. It should trouble them.
Because the core of the story is the same in all four. After Jesus is placed in the tomb, it's visited on Sunday morning by a small group of women, and they find the body is gone.
Now, you've studied law.
Yale law, yes.
And then you know that when policemen question several witnesses at a crime scene, they never expect the secondary details to be consistent as long as the core account is the same. In fact, if they're too similar, it's suspect.
That's true.
Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here.
The empty tomb is based on evidence, and isn't evidence your trade?
It is. Yes, but what if
The resurrection is one of the historical details that was recorded incorrectly.
how can we know? How can we ever know?
Lee, let me ask you something. Do you really want to know the truth, or is your mind already made up, regardless of the facts?
Oh, look, Doc.
I'm a journalist, okay? It's my job to challenge assumptions until they're proven otherwise. That's all I'm doing.
No, and I get that. But when is enough evidence enough evidence?
There's a couple of things that are addressed in that video, and we're going to tackle both, but let's start with the first one that I already talked about. And that is that if you're trying to make an argument, and you're trying to create a false narrative, you're not going to use the people that are not the most credible, right? You're not going to look for the person that is going to be your witness that is not going to be the greatest witness that people would take into consideration. And as we look at the gospel accounts, and it's talking about women being the first to get there, then we understand that there is one of two issues. One is they're not very smart people, and they're simply making an argument based on the culture that is not going to hold up. Or possibly, which is the most likely, these men were simply recording what had happened. And it was the women who got there first. They're not trying to come up with a story, because if they were trying to come up with a story, you wouldn't use women as your source of reference, especially in that culture. So once again, we look at these things, and some people, like Lee Strobel, as he's an atheist, he's saying, well, it doesn't make sense. Why would you use women where they're not the most reliable? You're right. Why would you? Unless it's the truth. And it's not going to help your case. It's going to hurt your case. And that's a lot of things that you'll find. And the second thing that was mentioned in that clip is something that many argue regarding the four Gospels that seem to have details that are missing or that are added. They don't all line up. It seems like at times there are certain events that are recorded in the Bible where they give another detail that ultimately doesn't seem to be given in a different gospel. So as he mentioned in the clip, well, first it says Mary, then there's another woman, there's more, right, in the next gospel in the next gospel account. And you can see the same thing even in Peter's denial. Peter denies Jesus, and it says that there was a girl, then it's a young servant girl, and he keeps on elaborating on the story. So is it possible that maybe, for some odd reason, they're just making up these stories? And the answer is no. Here's the way that we have to look at those things. If you have ever heard somebody fabricate a story, just like I said, one of the things that you will not do is give an unreliable source if it's false. But here's the thing. If it's the only person that was there and they saw it, you're going to say it for what it is. That's the person that was there. And I'm just telling you what I saw. The second thing is, if you're fabricating a statement, you will know this, that you would try to do everything in your power to not say the exact same details. And that's something that detectives do. They're trying to figure out what was the story. Now, something that is going to damn your case is if you actually use word-for-word statements. So let's just say that everybody in this room is trying to come up with a story, an alibi for something. Here's the last thing that you're going to do, is you're going to say, we're going to say this, and we're going to say it in the same way. Because if you say it in the same way, guess what? Somebody's lying. because all of them sound exactly the same. It's almost like they gathered together to share the same story with the same details. And one thing that you will see, and on Sunday I'm going to be showing a clip from James Warner Wallace, who was a detective and an atheist, but he actually came to Christ because he read the Gospels, and he says, one of the things that I notice about the witness accounts is they vary in details, but they stay true to the core event, which is what you want. Otherwise, it would be suspect. If you're seeing and hearing everybody saying the exact same thing, somebody's been talking. Somebody's trying to create a story. But if you hear the same event from different perspectives, giving you different details, that makes sense. Because everybody's recording things from a different point of view. Now, I want to do one more thing before we kind of begin to wrap up. There's two more videos that I'm going to show, and the first one is going to be one thing that people will ask about the resurrection. So let's just say Jesus did die. And that's going to be the first argument is, well, if Jesus really did die, maybe what happened is people had mass hallucinations. Everybody was imagining the same thing. So here's some arguments that Lee Strobel poses in regards to this.
As much as I would like to help a fellow skeptic, what you're proposing is completely impossible.
But how can you say that? I mean, if Charles Manson can turn his followers into murderous zombies, surely the followers of the Christ cult could be convinced of their own delusions.
Listen, hallucinations are like dreams. They happen in individual minds. They don't spread like the common cold.
Okay, so a hypnotist turns a stage full of insurance salesmen into clucking chickens, then that's not really happening, or?
No, of course it is. The power of suggestion can be very profound, but it's one thing to be mesmerized into making animal noises. It's quite another for 500 people to have the same dream. To be honest, that would be an even bigger miracle than the resurrection itself.
And without an empty tomb, you and I, we're not even having this conversation. If Jesus recovered from his injuries, that solves that problem. All these people could have easily seen him, yes?
Yes, but I'm afraid that's not a brain issue. You need to speak to a medical doctor.
Of course.
Maybe a ton of people just simply hallucinated the same thing. And that's something that has been asked by many people. You know, if you begin to look at history, there is something known as, I think it's called the dancing plague, where many people began to dance and they wouldn't stop. And that's one thing that they've actually attributed to. Mass hysteria. People simply fed off of each other and they kept on going on the same thing. Maybe what happened is a lot of people hallucinated the same thing and saw Jesus, but it's really not Jesus that was there. It was people simply imagining it. Now, I want you to remember something about the clips that I'm showing. It's based on a true story. That's actually an atheist and an agnostic speaking and trying to debunk that Jesus was actually seen afterwards. And the agnostic professor says, yeah, it's just not possible. As a matter of fact, mass hallucination to that scale would be a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself. It just can't happen. Maybe, once again, people say, well, people saw Jesus, but it wasn't really real. But then we get to the last thing that we're going to be talking about. And that is that people did see Jesus. And it's going to contradict the last argument that we're going to be tackling today, while there's many. But one of the things that people say, well, maybe, once again, and it's what I started with, maybe Jesus didn't really die. Maybe what we're talking about today is maybe like the worst, most gruesome event in history, but it's not the death of a divine being. And this is going to tackle something that, it's going to tackle two things. For one, the first argument is, and this is something that is still circulated within the Jewish people, but one of the things that we have to understand is Christianity derives from Jewish tradition or the Jewish people. Now, the Jews don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They're still waiting for their Messiah. They believe that Jesus was maybe a prophet, but more than likely a crazy person. And the second thing is people say, well, maybe the reason that Jesus was not there in the tomb, there was an empty tomb, is for this reason, which Matthew chapter 28 addresses. A meeting with the elders was called, and they decided to give the soldiers a large bribe. They told the soldiers, "You must say Jesus' disciples came during the night while we were sleeping, and they stole the body." Perhaps the reason that there was no body is because somebody stole it. They were trying to keep the story going. Now, one of the things that I'm going to just quickly address is the body could not have been stolen. And the reason is because any soldier who ultimately lost sight or lost a prisoner from escape, they would have been put to death. And this is something that you actually even see with Paul. When they think that they escaped because the prison gates were open, the soldier was ready to kill himself because he knew that that was going to be his outcome. It would have been impossible. Not only that, but we see that that was the very reason that they put guards there, because they said they're going to try to make it look as though he's missing, even though he's not. Yet, they still came and stole the body, even though they had guards in place for that very reason. That makes no sense. And then there's some who say, well, maybe it's a spiritual concept, right? And this is arguments that begin to happen even within the church, where people say, well, it wasn't a physical body, it was more of a spiritual resurrection. That's what we're talking about. And the Bible addresses that very topic as well. Therefore, it was necessary for Jesus to be made in every respect like us, his brothers and sisters, so that he could be our merciful and faithful high priest before God. Then he could offer a sacrifice that would take away the sins of his people. He had to be made like us in every way. The incarnation of Jesus was necessary so that he could be made like us in every way, physically like a man. He didn't experience pain in any lesser of a way. We often think that, but even Hebrews says he experienced everything, and he's able to understand us in our weaknesses and our pain and our suffering because he went through all of it. 2 John chapter 1, verse 7 states, I say this because many deceivers have gone into the world. They deny that Jesus Christ came in a real body. There are people who will argue and say it wasn't a physical body. The Bible is addressing that very issue. And it says such a person is a deceiver and an antichrist. It's in opposition of Christ. And the book of Hebrews continually points out not only the divinity of Christ, but the physical embodiment of Christ. There are multiple details that really go throughout the ministry and life of Jesus that we can go to, but one detail that is extremely unique, and we're getting ready to close it up, but one detail that is extremely unique, and it is found in Luke chapter 22, verse 44, it states this little detail. Jesus was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell from the ground like great drops of blood. It's a very bizarre and unique detail, because now it seems to be over-spiritualizing something that we don't experience physically. Now, here's what I found, and I'm quoting. While it is a very rare medical phenomenon that's been reported about 12 or 14 times in the world in medical literature, hematidrosis is a real condition that has been reported a dozen of times in people who are under tremendous stress and agony. Guess what? People have sweated blood, and it's in the medical books. It's something that can happen when you're under tremendous when you're in a position where you know what's coming and you're very stressed at what's taking place. And that's how we're going to be closing, because Jesus knew what was going to happen. Jesus had a physical body, and he knew exactly what he was going to be enduring at the cross. It is the most gruesome and excruciating pain that would result in his death, but our victory. And here's the one thing that you need to remember regarding this. When it comes down to crucifixion, Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified because they understood it is a humiliating and terrible way to die. And aside from the blood, once again, which is a physical symptom, there is another detail that is given that helps us to put to rest any doubt whether Jesus was actually physically embodied or if maybe it was a spiritual death. And here's the last video that I want you to check out.
The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the best attested events in the ancient world. And, if you will, the final nail in the coffin, at least one theory, is this. When the soldiers thrust their spear between Jesus' ribs, do you know what came out? Blood and water, which we now know is a description of pericardial effusion as a result of death by asphyxiation. This is not a condition anyone could fake. And so to answer your question, yes, it is my medical opinion that Jesus Christ died on that cross.
Pericardial effusion. That's an actual medical condition coming from a doctor that's telling you that's what takes place. If I understand this correctly, pericardial effusion is when the water where there's this reference of water and blood pouring out of Jesus' side would have actually been the separation of blood and bone marrow. That's what you're seeing, which would tell you something. Jesus was already dead before that even happened. His body would have actually been at rest, and ultimately there was already a separation from the blood that was taking place. And there are so many more details that we have to understand when we look at Jesus' physical death, right? He's sweating blood. There is this piercing that takes place, and none of his bones are crushed, which is something that was prophesied about. That's the way that they check to make sure he's dead. Even if Jesus was not dead at that point, he would have died from that very piercing. Nobody could have survived it. And as you begin to study more about crucifixion, we often picture that the nails go through here. They don't. They actually went through here. We have to understand that in the Bible, when it references hands, and this is something that's going to be kind of funny and something that's kind of weird, but my wife a while back asked me, because I referenced to fingers, and she kind of laughed because it seemed like it was off. But when you look at translations of Spanish to English, we call these fingers, we call these toes. In Spanish, they're all fingers. So if I were to tell you, can you just kind of hold my fingers, I could be talking about these, or I could be talking about these. When the Bible talks about hands, it's not simply talking about what would reference here, it's more from here to here. And when you would put a nail here, if something was put through there, you would actually fall off. You wouldn't stay on. If you go through the bone, you're locked in. You're not going anywhere. And as this is happening, the worst part about crucifixion is that every breath is painful. You're pretty much struggling to survive. You're painfully surviving. And every word that Jesus would have spoken would have been difficult for him. Because in order to speak, you have to raise yourself up on those very nails that are put into your arms. Otherwise, your entire body, gravity is working against you. And in order to take one more breath, to live a little bit longer, you have to pull yourself up on those wounds. It is a very painful death to die. The reason that today's death is so good is because without it, we would have no hope. And another thing that people really don't understand is, well, if God is so merciful, why would he put his son through this, right? Even though Jesus is one with God, is God, why do this? I heard an argument, well, if God is so loving, I mean, maybe he could have just had us do 3 jumping jacks, 2 push-ups, something that would have been easy instead of having to put his son through hell. And I heard this conversation that really helped me to see things in a different perspective, even though I understand the gravity of it. It was so good, and I want to quote it to you. Because sacrifices seem so foreign in our culture. We don't understand the concept of a sacrifice. And this is what they said in this conversation. There's a lot of things that the temple was, right, in the Old Testament. One thing was that the temple was a butcher shop, because you would kill animals there. The high priest was a butcher who was going to slay the bull or the lamb that was brought in as a sin offering. This still happens in the year 2025, unless you're a vegan. That sounds weird. Where do we see this? If you eat meats, you are feeding off of the death of another. The priest was teaching you a spiritual principle in a very physical way. That animal dies that I might live. But in a spiritual sense, that priest is pointing you towards a story in which something or someone can take your death on themselves in order that you might live. When you eat steak, something had to die, but that's bringing you nutrition. It's bringing you the nutrients that are needed to survive. You're feeding off of another. There had to be a death. When we look at it through this lens, it brings the words of Jesus to life when he says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Anyone who eats this bread will live forever. And this bread which I will offer so the world may live is my flesh. Spiritual concept. It's helping you to understand you have to feed on me to live. I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you cannot have eternal life within you. But anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise that person at the last day. We get to live off of the life of another. That's the reason it's so good. It's a heartbreaking story because nobody in this room loves anyone that much. And you might say, well, I would die for my wife or my kids, but would you die for your enemy? Because that's what the Bible says. That while we were still enemies of Christ, he came and died for us. Jesus' body becomes a sacrifice that makes us right so that we could have eternal life.